Good evening. For those who don't know me, my name is Aleš Ernitzel. For those from the American sphere or Anglo-Saxon sphere, Aleš is similar to Alex or something like that, so that you can learn how to pronounce my name. To my right is my guest, Josh Neal, author of a couple of books I got interested into when I first saw him on, I think it was Peter Quinones. Um, my plan today is to talk about his newest book, um, which is connected to his previous book in a way. So we'll have to touch that previous book too. Um, so his previous book that the newest book is based on is called Understanding Conspiracy Theories. And the book will basically discuss today is his newest book. Um, Let me just see something. Yeah, his newest book is Intolerant Interpretations. So, Josh, thanks again for accepting my invitation. We talked a little bit before the stream. I told him I was a lazy fuck who didn't read his book, but I got a grip of what it was all about, and I got really interested into it. So he doesn't have to persuade me to read it till the end when this stream ends. So, Josh, welcome.
Thank you so much, Alish, for having me on. And to your audience who may not be familiar with me, yeah, my name's Josh. I'm from New York. I'm an American. Don't hold it against me. I studied psychology. I was a adjunct lecturer for close to a decade. And I had as we were saying before we started, I had aspirations of being a practicing psychologist, a clinician. I did apply for my PhD. I did not end up pursuing that route, mostly because of the political climate at the time, but also because of my own, if you want to say, lack of confidence in the discipline and the role of a clinician. I always liked to think in psychological terms, and I've always, from a young age, had sort of a philosophical bent, even if I didn't always, I wasn't like 12 years old reading Immanuel Kant or anything like that. But that kind of thinking was always close to my heart, I guess, if you want to say. And yeah, I've written a couple of books published by Imperium Press, American Extremist. It was a very well received book. A few years, or actually last year, I published my second book also through Imperium Press called Understanding Conspiracy Theories. And most recently, basically a month and a day ago, I published with Antelope Hill a book called Intolerant Interpretations. And if you want to say my academic interest or my philosophical interests have been informed pretty much entirely by my experiences getting involved with online radical politics. So that was actually what the first book was about, was trying to, from a psychological point of view, explain or understand radicalism and political extremism. And it's not an original, hypothesis. Basically, the main argument, although the book does branch off into a lot of other subjects, the main thesis is that the problem of political extremism is not it's not a problem that's constructed by incel white men or fascists or anything like that. It's a natural outgrowth, a byproduct of, and in many cases a response to the neoliberal hegemonic order. What we often talk about is the unipolar American or Atlanticist order, which for most people in the mainstream has really only become sort of a problem in the current woke era, I think its roots trace a lot back earlier. So, and it's a very even-handed analysis. It's not just looking at liberals or just looking at conservatives or fascists or communists. It's really kind of a holistic examination of psychological dysfunction in America. I mean, the book is called American Extremist. So I wouldn't want to claim that my thoughts extend to Europe or, you know, elsewhere in the world, but by the same token, you know, the reach of America is very vast, and you don't have to be an American to be subjected to and subjugated by a lot of the ideas and ideologies and memes that are basically fomented here. The second book was Understanding Conspiracy Theories. The name tells you everything to know. Again, it's sort of in the same way that extremist is a pejorative that is often used to marginalize people with dissenting political beliefs. Conspiracy theory, conspiracist, conspiratorialism, these are all this is all language, polemical language that's meant to discourage people from launching their own independent investigations into why and how things happen around the world. People, your audience, you know, probably have heard the idea that the polemic of conspiracy theorists is a construction of the CIA, and that is true. But it's also now kind of a part of the common language. And whether it's expressly a sort of polemical psychological warfare device, it also does map to an actual social reality. So I think we can talk about conspiracy theorists and conspiracies as real things, not just as a sort of a device to protect the establishment against dissenting points of view. And as you said, the most recent book is a continuation of the same idea, and Intolerant Interpretations basically picks up where my last book left off, but it goes in a different direction. It's not solely interested in explaining the phenomenon of conspiratorialism, but it's much more concerned with developing further developing this idea that I put forth of a general suspicion culture or culture of suspicion. I don't know if you are familiar with during COVID, Joe Rogan had Dr. Robert Malone on, who's a sort of a public intellectual here in the United States, a psychologist, who during COVID basically put forth this idea of a mass formation psychosis. And it was his way of basically describing the increased craziness, insanity of American life, and how people are they're increasingly, on one hand, they're increasingly engaging in this conspiratorial discourse, but they're also increasingly less in touch with a grounded material reality, a shared social reality. And while I think there's something to his idea, I'm actually not comfortable with excessive psychological psychiatric language, and I don't think it's a medical condition or a condition of the mind in the way that like schizophrenia or diabetes are conditions of the body and the mind. I view it much more in sociological terms and in political terms, which is why rather than using this language of mass formation psychosis, I prefer my own language of suspicion culture. It's the social forces that, excuse me, that produce skepticism, that produce doubt and paranoia and conspiratorialism. And there even is a subfield within sociology which already examines this phenomenon. It's called agnotology, and it's been around maybe a few decades. Basically, the idea of agnotology is very similar to my idea of suspicion culture. It's that there are intentional social forces which produce doubt, that undermine trust, that foment suspicion and skepticism. And maybe your audience, I don't know if your audience is like, oh, sociology, that's like liberal nonsense. But I think there's good reason to accept that hypothesis. And we don't even have to talk about it in conspiratorial terms. We can think about it in terms of our everyday experience. You turn on the television or you scroll through your social media feed and you're bombarded by advertisements and marketing that all are geared towards, well, for example, you have a car and you see an ad for a new car, and the advertisement tells you that this new car is so much better than your car, and women will like you more if you buy this car, and you'll be cooler and you'll have a better paying job and you'll impress people. So a lot of the social reality that we are a part of is really about undermining your confidence in things and instigating you and cajoling you into desiring things, maybe things you wouldn't have desired before, right? Another good example would be like gender ideology, right? You're not actually a 12-year-old tomboy. You're actually your true essence is masculine, and you should completely change your body and permanently alter your body and your mind to unleash this true reality of who you are. So whether we're thinking of it in terms of politics and popular culture, or we're thinking of it in terms of these other elements, I think there's something. I think it's just factually true that there are sectors of society and of the economy whose main function is to provoke a sort of schizophrenic, schizotypal affect in people. So it's a little bit of a long-winded introduction, but yeah, that's me, and I'm happy to keep talking about the book.
What's your hypothesis? Why do they exist? What would be their main function? Why would the regime have such a body or such an institution?
Well, in the case of like advertising and marketing, there's like sort of a basic profit motive, an economic. There's a market. There's a market, or you can create a market for things, or there's existing markets and people are competing for profit incentives. You see an ad for a fat loss program, and it's obviously a profit incentive to create in you a desire that maybe didn't exist before, to be thinner, fitter, sexier, more desirable, have better sex, have a more attractive romantic partner. Dating apps are very similar in this way. The whole idea of like a Tinder or a Bumble or a whatever is not really to get people to pair off and form families, but to trap people into a market so they can extract profits from them. But that would be one way. Obviously, we're more interested in the political reasons, justifications for that. And the explanation for that is also very simple. It has a sort of disciplinary function, which is to say it's to control people. It's to organize people in a particular direction. You want to keep a population or a territory in conformity with a certain narrative or ideology or political formulation. So if, for example, you had like a third party candidate who was very popular and his presence undermined participation in the other two major political parties. And here in the United States, a good example would be the early 1990s with Ross Perot. George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton. George H.W. Bush was running for re-election, 1992. Bill Clinton was his opponent for the Democrats, and you had Ross Perot, who's this third party, capitalist, who, by virtue of just simply participating in the democratic process, was undermining the stability of the two-party system. And so you could say that there's an incentive to cast doubt, to instigate a sort of or undermine his platform, his popularity, and to reinforce faith in the two-party system by casting aspersions, by injecting innuendo, by psychological warfare, in effect, putting out ideas and concepts and memes and whisper campaigns that would destroy his political campaign. Now, in the case of someone like Ross Perot, and this was also true of other popular populist third party or people outside of the normal framework, like a David Duke or a Patrick Buchanan or even a Donald Trump. These are people who sort of represent a third way in American politics that is not conventionally Republican, conventionally Democrat, and that creates instability in the American political system because we have an oligarchy, and any truly populist, truly democratic candidate that actually represented the interests of the people poses a threat to financial interests, poses a threat to the established bureaucracy. And so from the point of view of suspicion culture or agnotology, the political motivations are very simple. It's to reinforce the establishment.
If it's not too peculiar of a question, what is a current consensus on the establishment level? What does a establishment right-winger or conservative on one hand and establishment progressive or left-winger has? What does he have to believe to stay inside the what's allowed?
Yeah. The common phrase that is often used is the post-war consensus. And whether you're a Republican, conservative of any stripe, or a liberal Democrat of any stripe, which is to say whether you're a right liberal or a left liberal, you're basically signed on to a set of narratives that was initiated, shaped, and reinforced ever since the climax of the Second World War. And so we call this the post-war consensus. And the post-war consensus, to try to be concise, it would basically be this idea of we're all invested in this free market, rational actor or rational agent theory of human agency, that we're all self-interested. We're all responding to rational incentives, that we are always trying to advance an economic interest, but also that we are egalitarian, that we are pluralist, that we are anti-racist, that we are philo-Semitic, that we are inclusive. Some phrases that everybody has probably heard. We all believe that diversity is our strength. We all believe that anybody can be an American or anybody can be a Westerner. We all believe things like there's no white race, there's no race, except when there are other races who we are sort of placating and ameliorating. But the post-war consensus basically refers to this system of narratives or the system of ideologies which advances the agendas of the American empire. So hopefully that was not too vague.
No. A form of interview I imagine to be the most effective for 1 hour or 1 hour and a half interview is, in my opinion, I will go through the questions in a very similar way I published it on Twitter, on X, if you don't mind. So I'll read the passage to make a context of the book, or an essay, more obvious, and then I will ask you the questions about the passage. Are you okay with it?
Perfect. Let's do it.
Okay. So the passages. This investigation, while limited as the title suggests, nevertheless provides a solid basis for rejecting both the consensus view of conspiratorialism as well as the mutated strains of neo-populist conspiratorialism which have emerged since the early years of the Trumpist revolution in American conservatism. So the first question, what is this conspiratorialism?
So two answers to that question. The first basically is actually, it'll help me to actually pull up what you were reading from. Sorry, it's been a while since I've actually been in the interview space. So conspiratorialism. So I have sort of a idiosyncratic definition, but I'll give you just a sort of plain answer to your question. Conspiratorialism, generally understood, is this inquisition into establishment narratives. A goofy example would be, whenever people talk about Michelle Obama in America, in the conservative circles, people will say they'll cast aspersions on her sexual identity, right? Big Mike, as opposed to Michelle Obama, right? And that kind of feeds into what I mean by this neo-populist conspiratorialism. So it would be a little bit long-winded and maybe getting ahead of ourselves to dive into that right away. But if you think of the 20th century as being this period of intense political rivalry and instability and uncertainty, it created its own conspiratorial culture. We had presidents and presidential candidates who were assassinated in full view of hundreds of thousands, millions of people. We had public speakers and intellectuals, whatever you may think of them, like MLK or Malcolm X, who were publicly assassinated, and it became a national, international news story. And naturally, those kinds of activities provoke a desire to understand what really happened. And this was in a sort of earlier, more naive time in the media culture of America, pre-internet, obviously. And you really at the outset of television, right? This is the beginning of visual mediums like television. And it provoked a conspiratorial culture, which is to say, an attempt by the average person to explain and understand complex social circumstances. Okay, was JFK really killed by Lee Harvey Oswald? Was it really a single bullet that struck him? Who has JFK's brain? Like these kinds of things. So that would be sort of the general answer to that question. But I've actually done more writing since. And I would say to follow up to this idea of neo-populist conspiratorialism, I wrote an essay for my Substack called Richard Hanania is Wrong About Conspiracy Theories. And in making my arguments, I basically give a newer, more idiosyncratic definition of conspiratorialism. And basically, what I would say, I'm just going to read a quick paragraph here from it. Anyone's interested in reading the whole essay, go to jneal.substack.com. But I'll start with this quote. So in the realm of legitimate discourse, we have conspiracies and conspiracy theories. Conspiracies are some attempt to construct or provoke a transformative event. Conspiracy theories then are attempts to understand and uncover and prosecute these people who are responsible for these conspiracies. But so those would be legitimate investigations, but there are also illegitimate discourses. And I would say illegitimate discourses deal with that which is merely conspiratorial. And so in my view, conspiratorialism usually deals with solipsism. It's usually superficial. It's usually a form of fantasy or role play. So when we say something is conspiratorial, what I tend to view conspiratorialism as is a type of discourse or a type of inquiry that's preoccupied with the taboo elements of conspiracy discourse, as opposed to the truth-seeking elements of discourse. Conspiratorialism, in my view, is that which seeks to engage in simple transgression for the sake of transgression. I alluded to before, the conspiracy theory that Michelle Obama is actually a man. To me, that's a prime example of conspiratorialism because it doesn't have a significant political consequence. It doesn't have a revolutionary or radical bent to it, but it has a sort of almost therapeutic effect. It makes the people who talk about it and conjecture about it feel good. It gives them a sense of community. Maybe it brings them a sense of like a thrill, a transgressive thrill. Ooh, she really is a man. But that's not politically consequential. It won't overturn the corrupt American order if we can discover that Michelle Obama is in fact, has a Y chromosome. So the conspiratorial to me is that which seeks to engage in simple transgression, whereas conspiracy theorists transgress only to uncover some fact or truth. The conspiratorial person sees transgression as its own end. By doing so, he or she participates in the creation of a culture of suspicion which stymies genuine understanding by obfuscating the relationship between cause and effect and by mystifying the real nature of actually political conduct.
But for example, if you were accused of conspiratorialism, would you be able to create a steelman for it as a legitimate quest for truth?
I mean, this is the problem in my view with neo-populism, is that it's fantastical and it's completely psychological as opposed to political. I don't know that I would be able or willing to steelman it because it's a sort of how to put it. It's more of a rear guard therapeutic type of phenomenon than a vanguard political phenomenon. I'm sure some people who believe, for instance, that there's value to uncover. There used to be this YouTube channel. Allow me a brief digression. There used to be this YouTube channel or series of YouTube channels like 5 or 10 years ago, where the content creator would show pictures of Hollywood actresses and make the argument that they were all secretly transsexual. And he would show like plastic surgery changes and maybe awkward footage of them walking or doing things where they kind of looked mannish. And I think the steelman argument would simply be, they're exposing the lie, that the act of pursuing some perceived truth is itself a radical political action. I think that only action constitutes radical political action, political organization, social organization. Placing your vote at the ballot box is a political action, but snickering about how Michelle Obama's dress folds up awkwardly in the middle of her groin is not really a radical political action. But I think these people would claim, and you know what? Just to take a step back, this is what anti-conspiracy people will say, this gets said about Tucker Carlson a lot. Oh, well, he's just asking questions. He's just asking questions. And he's just asking questions. So the idea that posing these questions or pointing at things that they don't want you to look at, they don't want you to pay attention to, I think in the minds of these people that has a sort of radical political dimension to it. I think we have to make these kinds of investigations meaningful. We have to have a much narrower scope. And I think you have to understand you have to establish some desirable outcome as a result of doing something. Like, this is part of my definition of a conspiracy theory. The end result of any conspiracy theory that's legitimate is the prosecution of some person or some group, right? Like with COVID. The point of engaging in conspiracy discourse as relates to COVID isn't to freak out about getting biochipped, but it's to prosecute people who shut down the global economy and basically ruin the lives of everybody in the world for 2.5 years or however long it lasted for, depending where you were living. So I'm not so much, not to evade your question, I actually don't think there's a merit to steelmanning that type of investigation, largely because it delegitimizes actual conspiracist investigations. Sorry, that was a bit rambly.
Yeah, no. I was just asking this question because I myself haven't been able to answer my own question of how to differentiate when is it legitimate and when is it not, because my thought about, for example, politics, I understood what you just told me, but my thought about politics was always it has to be probably the most normal thing in the world for people who have interests and have power, political power, to conspire. So it's the most normal thing for people to conspire, and I'd say that it's also normal for people to theorize about conspiracies. And you're making this distinction, and you have this terms, conspiratorialism and conspiracists, but I haven't been able to answer this question, how to differentiate. I can intuitively understand when someone goes into flat Earth discourse that it's not, at least not evidently politically relevant, or when someone says that Obama's wife is a man, or when Candace Owens went into Macron's whatever that is. So I can intuitively see that there's something wrong, but I haven't been able to rationally grasp and exactly show and define where's that exact line, so that you can say, okay, it's legitimate to theorize about this conspiracy, but it's not about that. Okay, direct political relevancy would be one answer. This would be probably your answer. If I you can correct me if I'm wrong.
No, you're dead on, and I would say part of the reason that you have this new neo-populist conspiratorialism is in my view, it's expressly a byproduct of 2 decades of internet access. And so what has happened is sort of everything has been depoliticized slowly over I think there's two events that directly led to this. One, the collapse of the Soviet Union, which basically led to this unipolar, neoliberal, global American hegemony. And 2, the development of the internet, which was the medium of extending American cultural dominance all around the world in a way that was more efficient, faster, more enticing than the television, more enticing than the radio, more enticing than MTV and Ice Cube and Britney Spears and the Power Rangers, because of what was unique about the medium of the internet, the way in which you could directly access and interact with everything. It's this sort of immediate database of human production and human experience. And as a result of it, you've had this sort of commodification of every space of social activity. So everything becomes a market. It has also had the effect of turning everyone into a kind of entertainer. So the immediate consequence of this was depoliticization. People are less politically active, whether that means they are less likely to vote or they are less literate in what's happening politically and culturally around them, or they're just more alienated, estranged, pacified by this new medium of the internet. So what was previously, and this is a major argument of the first chapter of the book, is that the 20th century was this period in American culture where conspiracy theories were more like classical investigative journalism. And the 21st century version of conspiracy theories is this sort of carnival barking commodity in the vein of an Alex Jones, in the vein of an Andrew Tate, in the vein of a Candace Owens. And while, you know, someone like Candace Owens, I certainly applaud her for having the courage to take up certain causes and to more directly challenge the established media complex in the United States. She is an entertainer, first and foremost. She is a broadcaster. She's not a politician. She's not an organizer. So her job really is to entertain and to disseminate information in this entertainment format. So what in the book, I draw a comparison between the Son of Sam killers, Maury Terry, and let's just use Brigitte Macron and Candace Owen as an example. For Maurice Terry in the 1960s and 70s and beyond that, to investigate David Berkowitz, to investigate the truth of the Son of Sam killings, it was not a media spectacle. It was something he did privately. It was something he did independently. It was something he did in opposition to multiple layers of American hegemony. He was doing it in opposition to local law enforcement. He was doing it in opposition to the courts, to other journalistic entities. He was doing it really against the sort of culture of the United States at that time. And it was this long-suffering kind of labor of love. And while he was on daytime talk shows talking about his stuff occasionally, it was an actual kind of blood, sweat, and tears investigation of truth. Whereas someone like Candace Owens, it's this multi-million-dollar media spectacle that without the internet wouldn't be possible. So I'm trying to narrow this down a little bit more because I feel like I'm losing the train of thought. What makes, say, Maury Terry legitimate and Candace Owens illegitimate, or put better, what makes Jim Marrs writing Crossfire about the JFK murder legitimate versus Candace Owens illegitimate, is that there's an actual mission statement, and there is an actual desire to prosecute an outcome. So Brigitte Macron, in the same way that people will hurl these kinds of accusations at Tucker Carlson, like I'm just asking questions. Candace Owens is a much better example of that, because there's, like, as I said before, there's no way to prosecute that conspiracy theory. For one, there's no crime, really. There's no victim, really. And it's also has this mystifying effect on actual political realities in France. Like, a more legitimate conspiratorial discourse might be what happened at the Bataclan. What a more legitimate conspiratorial discourse might be who burned down the Notre Dame Cathedral. I mean, those have actual political import because there was a victim, there was a crime was perpetrated against people. In the case of the Notre Dame, it's that crime was perpetrated against really every French man, woman, and child in that country. It's a crime against their history. It's a crime against Catholicism. It's a crime against, not to be dramatic, it's a crime against Western civilization. There is somebody who did something wrong, and uncovering who that would be would have a political consequence. Whether it was, minute, like we're going to jail this person, or it was broader, like exposing the conspiracy maybe of the media outlets who conspire to hide the identity or identities of the people responsible. So my definition of a conspiracy theory is that it always ends with the prosecution. And to me, that's the defining, legitimizing fact of any conspiracy discourse, is if it is leading to a prosecution, or it opens the door to the possibility of a prosecution. For example, with the JFK files being released, lots of people feel very secure that Israel played a significant role in the JFK assassination. Now, that has not literally led to a prosecution of the people who were involved, but it has opened the door now to that possibility, right? And that makes it a more legitimate conspiratorial discourse, because something of historical and political import has been made available to us, whereas investigating what's in between Brigitte Macron's legs has a mystifying effect. So it's sort of like Heideggerian, in the sense, like, is truth being disclosed? Is truth being revealed? Or is it being obfuscated? Is it being mystified? Is it a sort of shell game where we are directing attention in one direction and away from another direction? So I would say, long-winded answer to your question, but I would say the two things that separate a legitimate conspiratorial discourse from an illegitimate conspiratorial discourse is that it discloses truth, and it opens the possibility for justice. Those would be my defining characteristics.
Yeah, but to be honest, Candace Owens would probably say here that, okay, this could lead us to something bigger of a true political relevance. For example, the decadence, the pedophilic inclinations of elites or something like that. That would probably be her answer to what you just said. And to be honest, it would make sense if she'd say it like that, wouldn't it?
Maybe it's a lack of imagination on my point of view, but I don't. You couldn't jail Emmanuel Macron for that. You couldn't depose the French oligarchy for that. You couldn't reverse racial replacement as a result of that. You wouldn't be able to restore the prominence of the church in France as a result of that. It may have a narrower, more particular outcome, but I think putting it in context, the political challenge is not this sort of whack-a-mole game where we're just kind of haphazardly exposing things. We are confronted with a civilizational challenge. That's what the Great Replacement is. It's a threat. It's an existential threat. Brigitte Macron being Emmanuel Macron's father or whatever it is that Candace Owens says is not an existential threat to the French or European or Western way of life in the way that, you know, the Bataclan attacks were a threat on the French way of life, in the way that, I mean, literally before we went on air, I was just reading a tweet thread of some French woman documenting a North African man trying to rape her. That's an existential threat. That's a political threat. That's a civilizational threat. To me, the Macron issue, the Brigitte Macron issue, is more of a sideshow. And I think it's to steel man her point and to give credence to what you're saying, there is some significance to it. But to go back to my earlier point, you have to have a political mission. What is the political mission? To restore the prominence and the sovereignty of European peoples in their own homes. Now, maybe Candace Owens has a different mission for what she's doing, but I'm also not on Team Candace Owens. I mean, I sort of sympathize with her as a symbol of resistance against the establishment media in the United States, but I don't align with her as a political champion of my cause. So maybe there's some other political cause that she's a champion of, but if we're doing a sort of hierarchy of political challenges, the biggest issue isn't that Emmanuel Macron is married to his brother or something. It's that Emmanuel Macron is presiding over the death of French civilization.
Yeah, I mean, I understand what her point is, and for example, I to be honest, I believe that Jews who say that she's anti-Semitic, with the exception of the fact that the majority of Jews she's against are probably very little Semitic, but I do think that she's going into the direction that there's a devious, quasi-Jewish, Frankist ideology, culture, religion behind what elites do, and I think she's pointing into the direction that Macron is basically a victim of it, installed into a position to be able to have control over him. That's her point, basically. If you're,
I hear what you're saying.
Yeah.
My only counterpoint would be, I believe in parsimoniousness, and that is a little too. I mean, that almost went over my head, what you just said. I get what you're saying, and I do kind of agree with what you're saying. But there's, again, I almost put myself in the position of a lawyer prosecuting a case in front of a judge. Is that the strongest case I can make to a judge who maybe is not sympathetic to the case I'm trying to make? I could say, well, this puppet show spectacle of marionette dolls that are controlled by a racial oligarchy who have a ethno-religious gripe against us. That's one case to make. A far simpler case to make is, hey, there's a legal program of replacement against us. Like, that's a much easier case to prosecute. I think keeping in mind that, and this goes to another idea of the book, of both Understanding Conspiracy Theories and Intolerant Interpretations, is that we are in there's a bipolar conflict. There's the regime and there's the folk. And the regime has their own narrative construction mechanisms, but they also have a sort of full spectrum ability to enforce those narratives and to prosecute people for going against those narratives. As the folk, who are sort of disaffected, alienated, politically disempowered, we don't have the resources and we don't have the means to enforce the narratives that we are trying to inject into the discourse. And so I think This is an interesting. This point you're raising. I think it speaks to a sort of a tension in radical politics that I've observed, especially in people who are into identitarianism and like pro-white politics nominally. There has always been this hostility towards conspiratorialism, precisely for the reason that we don't have the resources or the manpower or the mechanisms to turn our truth seeking into political action. And for those reasons, it's sort of like a waste of time and energy to go after these harder to prosecute theories, right? What is easier to prosecute? It would be easier for me to document replacement migration in my town and present it to like my local city council member than it is for me to wage a multi-continental information war against Emmanuel Macron and his Jewish bankers, his whatever, Goldman Sachs bankers, whatever the actual banking cartels behind him. It's hard. It's all borderline impossible to prosecute that. And as a person who is, in the case of Candace Owens, even as high profile as she is so far removed from actual political action that you do run the risk of basically delegitimizing yourself in the minds of a audience that really is looking for a champion, that really is looking for the truth, and want somebody credible to take up that cause, I guess, would be my point.
Well, my point against her or against her line of thought would be not on the basis of parsimoniousness, but on the basis of the fact that she's the line of thought of this, I'd say, Catholic line of thought, although many secular people or atheists that are more into identitarian side of thinking use it too. They are trying to say that the regime is somehow satanic. It's not earthly. It's not human. It made a pact with a Satan or something like that. And in my opinion, for us who are not part of the regime, it doesn't work well. We have to know what their actual exact political, economical, and other powers are. And if they have outer earthly powers, then we don't have anything against them. We're powerless, basically. So it's useless. It's useless. They are gods, basically.
Right.
The implication of this line of thought is they are basically gods, although mainly Greek gods, not the real creator God, but they're gods and we are powerless against them. This is my problem with it.
Yeah, and that's very well said. And it calls to mind when Alex Jones did the Joe Rogan Experience for the first time, and he started riffing about interdimensional vampires. I've been to the fourth dimension, folks. There is real deal metaphysical aliens. Okay, and yeah, that you can't punch God. You can't behead Nosferatu. You can't. Like it's too fantastical and supernatural and greater than man. The other thing too is that, and this is not something that people talk about anymore or talk about as much, but the line of conspiratorialism that people like Candace Owens, and I don't want to beat up on Candace because at the end of the day, I think she does at least as much good work as she does kind of crank work. And all you need to do is one or two good things to create some damage, and there's merit to that. But it was similar with the WEF, the World Economic Forum, Klaus Schwab. They use the same language of Satanism and demonology and invoking all of this supernatural, superstitious language, when really that's a sort of, I mean, I made a joke many years ago on a podcast with Keith Woods. I said it was called the World Economic Forum and not the World Economic Policy Institute. It's called the World Economic Forum and not, the World Economic Chamber of Commerce. It was basically a spectacle for political insiders to go and kind of be weird perverts. It was sort of like Lollapalooza for the Klaus Schwab types. And that sort of kind of got vindicated by the fact that there were social media, viral social media videos of like people playing their flutes, wearing their weird Dr. Evil suits. And it's like, okay, I get that this is weird. I get that this raises certain red flags about, excuse me, who these people are, what they believe, what they pray to. But, the bigger issue, if you want to point to gatherings of people, again, to invoke Alex Jones, would be like a Bohemian Grove. Would be like any of these other things where there's actual power brokers organizing, where there's actual sort of smoky back room decisions being made. Pardon me. Speaking of smoky back rooms, I've been smoking too many cigarettes myself. They use that same language of demonology to basically describe like an auxiliary power of the establishment, sort of these apparatuses that are further removed from actual policy creation and policy implementation. And yeah, to your point, I think that's where the real problem is. It's innately disempowering, and it's innately obfuscating.
Yeah, I'm interested in what are the effects of their rituals, for example. Yeah, they have weird rituals. They drink virgin blood or whatever. But what are the effects against us, and what can we do against it? This is what I'm interested in. Although I, as a Catholic and not an atheist at all, I should be interested in this kind of weird metaphysics, whatever that is. But I'm not, to be honest. But okay, this is not an argument. What if I'm not interested? It doesn't matter. But as I said, my argument is, what are the effects? This is the most important thing.
Yeah, I agree. Do you have another question, or how long are we going to go for, by the way?
How much time do you got?
I can do another hour.
Okay. I'll be a little bit faster now. Another question in accordance to this passage would be, what would be the consensus cult of expertise? I get it that it's a regime part of the equation, but can you tell me something more about it?
How to put this more concisely? Well, again, we're talking about the post-war consensus is, in my view, innately bound up with managerialism and the technocracy. And I don't think that means that the post-war consensus was sort of an inevitable consequence of mass democracy and technical expertise, but really as a result of the way things did happen, World War II, destruction of Europe, so on and so forth. It led to a situation where the narrative that was being constructed, upon which the new Europe and the new America were going to be built, couldn't be trusted to anyone to administer. You couldn't just allow, Uncle Steve, your neighbor from across the street, random people to be administering these narratives. You would have to have trusted individuals and institutions who would basically never go off script, would never compromise the integrity of the establishment, and were skilled and sophisticated in administering that narrative. Now, in the 1950s, 60, pardon me, prior to the internet, it was certainly easier to administer these narratives because of the limitations, the technological limitations of the communication and information mediums of the 20th century. They were fantastical, obviously. They ushered in a new era of Western civilization, but they were, less efficient, less totalizing. Like, I think it's obvious to everyone that there's a distinct difference between your smartphone and, the 3 or 4 hours a day you may have had to sit in front of the television. Basically, you've got a propaganda device with you 24/7, and it's much more engrossing, much more stimulating. So back then, you needed trusted, credible, capable individuals and institutions to administer the new narrative of neoliberalism, of sort of anti-Europeanism, of American exceptionalism. And I don't say this to poo-poo America. I'm an American. I'm a proud American. But obviously, the narrative of the post-war consensus, I don't view as an authentically American phenomenon. I don't view it as representing actual folk Americana. So the consensus cult of expertise basically is this network of credentialed peoples. Usually that means university academics, media personalities, whether that's like Walter Cronkite or Bob Dylan or Daniel Day-Lewis to a certain. I mean, we don't think of actors and as being like on the same level as maybe a PhD or a revered television journalist, but they are nonetheless the avatars of the new Western civilization, the new American society. So the consensus cult of expertise really is this sort of at some points loosely organized and some others more tightly organized network of people who are administering the post-war consensus. I was recently reading Who Paid the Piper, which is a great book about the Cold War psychological operations and information warfare. And it's, it outlines how, for example, famous poets, famous novelists, famous philosophers and academics, James Burnham being a really good example, were at the forefront of fighting a counterculture war against Soviet Russia and global communism. And that would be a really good example of this consensus cult of expertise, because it was a intelligence operation. It was, when people think of the deep state, should automatically call to mind these kinds of operations, pseudo-government operations that networked with universities, networked with the media apparatuses to fight, what's the old cliche? Fight for the minds and hearts of the average person. So that's really what the consensus cult of expertise is.
This is an interesting point Jonathan Paul made. Up until about 2006, thought the continued presence of people that remember the pre-war years was an obstacle for the establishment. My grandmother never brought the post-war consensus, and this kind of struck me because this was just the thing I was thinking about a couple of days ago, because I was watching this political establishment in Slovenia is totally Americanized. So the issues, the problems, the topics that are brought up in TV and via mainstream parties and so forth is American. So what you get from this Americanization is that what I've noticed lately is that besides geopolitical questions about Ukraine, Russia, Israel, Gaza, and so hypothetical war with Iran and so forth, you get basically two main topics, which are should men compete in women's sports, and the other topic is, would you like to pay less and get paid more? Which are, at the end of the day, these are quasi or pseudo right-wing conservative topics, or at least topics where conservatives have very decisive answers. And I do think that at least in Slovenia, I don't know a lot of people that would say, yeah, men should compete in women's sports. Probably the majority of left wingers, liberals, would say, no, this is nonsense. And also the majority of people would say, yes, I would like to pay less and get paid more. So this also implies that right wing should win 99% of the time, but it doesn't. Because in Slovenia, you have this topic of demonization and idolization of one Janez Janša, which is a free-time ex-prime minister and his leader of the mainstream right-wing party called SDS and so forth. So the left-wingers, they demonize him, and the right-wingers, they idolize him. And then at the end of the day, the people who go vote against him or for him, which is a bit similar to Donald Trump, a bit similar, but not totally, because this is a thing of 30 years, tradition of 30 years to vote against or pro Janša in Slovenia. But my point, I regressed a little bit. My point I was trying to make was that I don't know if there are really many people who buy into this publicly allowed discourses. What's your opinion on it?
I don't think it's necessary that people accept into their hearts and minds the precepts of these ideological transformations. In more meaningful, everyday ways, people are conforming to the changes within the institutions and the sort of social mediations that are happening. Jacques Ellul, in his book on propaganda, outlines this really clearly, that the sort of idea that propaganda is about changing the contents of what's going on between people's ears. It's not so much that people are avowed believers in anti-racism, the Holocaust as the raison d'etre of the West, or preventing the Holocaust rather as the raison d'etre of the West. I don't think the purpose of the post-war consensus is really about institutional control and about preventing people who would not conform to the political hegemony from getting into those institutions. So I mean, I sort of view as this as being the propaganda in a way, or the post-war consensus in a way, is more important. It's a disciplinary culture to usher in conformity on the part of people like you and me, but it's also a sort of way to pull up the ladder for people in academia, in DC, at the New York Times, what have you. What people, and this is something that I highlight in the book, the third chapter deals with, it's called Conformity in Political Economy. And it's basically detailing the sort of unconscious mechanisms of social behavior that get people to go along with coercive cultural malformations. And so, Does every college senior or freshman believe that XYZ thing about this fictitious Jewish run order that we have? In some cases, yes. I mean, I was, I was in college after 9/11, and most of the people that were my age and studying didn't have uh, contradictory, inflammatory thoughts about 9/11. And in that way, this is less to do specifically with the post-war consensus, but insofar as this top-down narrative construction happens, yeah, the average person kind of did think that 19 Arabs crashed a pair of airplanes into downtown Manhattan. Basically, everyone I talked to as a college undergrad thought that, again, not trying to be controversial, not trying to say anything that would get the wrong kinds of attention, but they basically thought that millions and millions of people were put through an industrial meat grinder by the German regime in the mid 20th century. Most people I've met my whole life thought Rosa Parks really did refuse to get up out of her chair in a bus in the middle of America. So in not insignificant ways, the average person is conforming and sort of accepting passively the presumptions about the major political events of their time. But the really important thing I've always viewed was that the purpose of these kinds of programs was to isolate problematic people and to select more conformist people. Now, they may be more conformist, or they may simply be more pathological, and are thereby, willing to be. If you want to think in Jordan Peterson terms, like the dark triad, they're more psychopathic, they're more Machiavellian, they're more narcissistic, meaning they are going to be better fits for the culture of the new post-war institutions. It's not really a problem, I think, for my argument, and it certainly hasn't been a problem for the regime, that a lot of people thought it was BS, and that older people in particular thought all of this stuff was BS. What has been more significant is that the avenues of political organization and reformation have been closed off entirely.
Would you say there's a good argument to be made against people like you and me, from the point of view of not only regime, but from the point of view of society, in the sense that status quo, no matter what kind of status quo it is always better than revolution. And then isolating people like us is preventing revolution.
Well, it's not really preventing it's preventing one kind of revolution and securing another. And I think just looking around the world that we're at now, I was just yesterday, I was on YouTube and I saw a clip of Theo Von, who's a famous American comedian here and podcaster, and he was talking about how he's on this 200 city tour for his new comedy special, and how virtually every city he's been to was completely destitute. And he's talking about major American cities. So the kind of revolution that has been permitted is this deindustrializing, technocratic revolution. That's basically, it's, what do people talk about? Like the NRX idea of the IQ shredder. Like we've by letting people like you and me, forcing us out or pulling up the ladder so that we can't ascend further into society, what they've allowed for is for people to who are basically fine with leading us into like a Mad Max future. That's the revolution that they've condoned. So I think objectively, where we're going is worse. Even if you and I were like, I don't know, whatever revolution you and I would foment, even if that was also going to be a disaster, I mean, it's really difficult to imagine a worse outcome than the one we're heading towards, where like there's total fertility collapse. There's, the industrial sector is totally destroyed, where even like the actual innovation for the most part has kind of slowed down. And it's become so dubious that, I mean, I think of like, again, this is a very American-centric example, but some years ago there was a controversy around Elizabeth Holmes, who was like one of these tech founder types who was putting forth, she was trying to get funding for her company Theranos, Theranos. They actually made like a Netflix series about it. She got found out as being a total shyster fraud. She was bilking these, you know, capitalist investors for enormous sums of money for a product that didn't work, didn't really exist, and was never going to go anywhere. So, I mean, we've gotten to such a point now where like people don't even believe in the prospect of technological innovation. Like one of the premises of what has supposedly makes America so great is that we are this bastion of innovation, that we've got the free market and we have free speech and we have all these opportunities and resources that allow businesses to be grown and millionaires to be produced every year and new innovations every year. And that hasn't happened. 20 years later, what was it? 2006 was like the invention of the iPhone. 20 years later, like Apple is still making the same fucking iPhone. And so, which is to say that there isn't actual innovation happening, but it's just people are much less credulous about it. So I don't see, again, you're proposing like an unknown known, like what would our revolution have been like? There's no way to know what that would be, but looking at what revolution they've allowed, it's hard to imagine a worse one.
I'm sorry to go a little bit back. It's about that topic on how experts should control the narratives or the public discourse. I've noticed that you published bits of that interview or that podcast on Joe Rogan, where Douglas Murray made this point against what was that libertarian Jew?
Dave Smith.
Dave Smith, yeah. That was basically his point. You shouldn't discuss topics unless you're an expert in them, which does have a merit to itself. But what does it mean at the end in the context of their discourse, for example? Because if you don't know if the regime is capable for creating a better world for us, and if the regime is not malevolent towards us folk, you have to know that first before you argue for this argument, wouldn't you say?
Well, the intrinsic problem, I know the segment you're talking about. The intrinsic problem with that is not so much that what Douglas Murray thinks he's referring to as expertise, he's referring to as credentialism. He's talking about you have to have an approved voice espousing a narrative, because what is Douglas Murray an expert of? Actually, he has a bachelor's degree in English, so he's not, in the like most technical sense of the word, he's not an expert. Okay, like he hasn't spent 20 years of his life studying military warfare, or being an anthropologist studying the Middle East, or being a sociologist studying the political structure of Hamas or whatever. He's a guy who went to school and ingratiated himself, however he did, into a system of power, and is now an approved voice to espouse a particular point of view. If we were real, and this is kind of like what makes the whole thing phony. I'm reminded of a book Tom Nichols wrote many, many years ago, The Death of the Expert, I think, or The Death of the Expertise. I forget the exact name of the book. But he was basically lamenting this phenomenon that we are all talking about. It was called The Death of Expertise. It was written by Thomas Nichols. He was basically lamenting the culture that we're now living in, where people don't just blanketly accept whatever a credentialed person in front of a television or in a university white paper says. And ultimately, I mean, in years gone by, our experts were more they actually did have expertise. They actually did go through a particular program, a particular type of technical training. They did have unique insights and skills that the general population didn't. And whether or not you want to argue that it was like phony baloney post-war consensus expertise or whatever, technically they went to the Ivy League university, they studied the discipline, they worked in the industry. Maybe it was all bunk, but they did it. And now, I mean, someone like Douglas Murray, everything that he's an expert of, he did outside. He cultivated that expertise outside of a formal institutional system. Him writing about the death of Europe, he's not a demographer, he's not an anthropologist, he's not a social scientist, he's not a political he now is a political apparatchik, but not in like a meaningful sense, not in a traditional sense of the word. So really, he's talking about, we want someone with the right credentials. Dave Smith is a representative of the folk account of history. He's just some guy who accumulated positive social capital, and as a result, maybe you can see him being a bit naive because he's also got a certain ethnic identity, and who knows what else is going on behind the scenes. But he does more authentically represent a certain point of view and a certain segment of the population. And while, he's not a learned person in the way that Thomas Nichols was, neither is Charles Murray. Or Douglas Murray, rather. So the question is it's highlighting this dialectic I've written about between the folk account of history and the regime account of history, that you have this bipolar epistemological tension, this civilizational knife fight to the death over what is true and what are we going to do about it. That's all that boils down to.
Yeah, basically. An optimal scenario would be, okay, you'd be schooled in knowing what a warfare is, you'd be schooled in the history, you'd be in the field, you'd be connected to Gazans, to Israelis, to many international intellectuals, not funded by Israel or something like that. And then after you'd go to Israel and Gaza and I don't know, make some observations, you'd be able to give the public some opinion on it. This would be an optimal scenario, but there's obviously not one person in the world that can provide us with this optimal scenario. So what we're left with is, of course, we all don't have the knowledge that would be optimal to provide us with the best information. But the question also is, should that mean that people shouldn't discuss it on the basis of half-truths, maybe half-truths, truths that cannot be that's what I wanted to say.
I'm sorry, can you restate that again a little bit differently? I didn't quite follow.
Yeah, I wanted to say is that the main question about this discussion is, should the fact that we don't have any experts mean that people shouldn't publicly discuss these topics? Of course, there should be a disclaimer on, or could be a disclaimer on such a podcast that is Joe Rogan's, that this is just public discourse, people discussing these topics. You won't get 100% optimal information on the topic because it's impossible. But yeah.
Well, the popularity of a Joe Rogan is a testament to the closed circuit that has become conventional media. And they're obviously like ass blasted about the existence of a Joe Rogan because it's an avenue for other people to try to have the conversations that aren't being had in the credentialed, approved spaces. Um, yeah, to your point, like you never have a perfect situation where you're going to get a 100% totally verifiable, true until the end of time kind of discourse. But that's also the only way things happen too, is you have to do it to produce the kinds of people that will be able to do it better. The first guys to ever have a kickboxing match were not the best guys ever kickboxing. The first car was not the best ever car. The first electric guitar solo was not played by the best. Chuck Berry made the electric guitar, a must-have instrument in everyone's home. Was he the best guitar player? Shit, no. So it's only through the act of doing something that we can produce better doings. Not to be like kind of grammatically stupid there, but and the fact that we are in this sort of situation where we're kind of having to reinvent the wheel a little bit is because in the establishment spaces they've decided it's better to let all of this die and preserve their control on this rapidly dwindling political empire than to risk the chance of any other possibility.
Yeah, another point I just remembered, he basically invoked, in my opinion, although he didn't articulate it, is that what should constitute an expert, for example, because it seemed like Douglas Murray articulated this argument not only as credentialism, but also as if he wanted to say that you need quale or qualia or subjective qualitative experience to be able to comment on political, social topics, which is in my opinion, okay, it's an opinion, it's an implication of his thinking, but if it were true, if this was our standard, then we'd have if any, so little, if any, experts at all about anything. We'd have to shut down the TV, the everything. Basically, if you need qualia for topics like that to discuss about the war, there you have to go to war. There, a bit absurd.
Yeah.
As
Well, he's also not on the front line, right? He's like, I immediately, when that segment went online, I immediately thought of that picture of him wearing the like bulletproof vest, sitting in the bombed out like living room or something for the photo op, and it's like, well, you're not. I don't think you were literally like on the front lines. I don't think you were like literally sitting next to the guy with the sniper blowing the heads off of Palestinian teenagers. I don't think he was actually just strolling through Gaza. He was invited by Benjamin Netanyahu and the Israeli establishment to be in select areas to portray a certain image, sort of like when people, I mean, this was the accusation that people made when Tucker Carlson did his special on Russia, and he's walking through the supermarket and he's like, wow, look at the Russian supermarket. And people said the same thing about him. It's like, yeah, you went to the part of Russia that they wanted you to be at so that you could convey this image to American conservatives about Russia was like, or like anything that they say about any communist regime in history. North Korea would probably be another example. Like you go through North Korea and you are on this basically, you are on this like naive tour, where you're being shown this highly, what's the word I'm looking for? tailored and curated scenario, set of settings to convey a certain image about what real life is actually like there. So in the same essay I quoted from earlier, the Richard Hanania essay, the main argument I was making is that we have this class of what I would call regime polemicists, basically people whose jobs are to get on the intellectual and cultural front lines and to espouse this verbal offensive against a dangerous political position. And that's ultimately what Douglas Murray is. Douglas Murray is a regime polemicist. He's not even a propagandist. He's just a polemicist. And his job is really to, again, he's creating this culture of suspicion around Israel and Zionism by undermining what, like you just said, like what makes someone justified to have a point of view on the issue in the first place. It should be very simple. You should be able to reflect on the things that you are seen and told and put forth a rational objection. A rational objection, or even a rational affirmation, whatever it's going to be. Pardon me, I've got the hiccups today. If what you were going to say to the footage of Gaza or whatever is that's great or that's a tragedy, both are valid insofar as 99% of us only have access to that information. So the point I was simply going to make was just that his role as a regime polemicist is to undermine the confidence that people have in the anti-Zionist position.
Yeah, about Elul. How do you pronounce Elul?
I'm an American. I'm dumb. I just say Elul.
Kahneman, Elul, and technocratic psychology. I'll just read this passage and then I'll go on to questions. Also makes us use of Gerd Gigerenzer's work in conjunction with the thought of French for sociologist Jacques Ellul to repudiate the heuristics and biases research program initiated by Israeli social scientist and Israeli Defense Forces member Daniel Kahneman. Kahneman's lifelong investigation into human decision-making has contributed greatly to the present-day climate of suspicion culture by undermining our understanding of and confidence in human cognition. His work, aided by longtime research partner Amos Tversky, has fortified the contemporary technocratic regime, which is synonymous with the cult of expertise, by demonstrating the alleged faultiness and unreliability of our native reasoning faculties. Kahneman's conclusions are now so ubiquitous that most Americans no longer believe in their own psychic sovereignty. Arguably as influential as Freudian psychoanalysis, if not more so, it is now taken for granted that the human brain naturally militates against objective, factual, logical reasoning. The interest in artificial intelligence and related technological developments is partly informed by the belief propagated by Kahneman and his ilk that the deficiencies of human psychology are too intractable to resolve through social or political means, and as a result, we are freely giving away our independence, our agency, and ultimately our very livelihoods to a psychopathic technocrat class whose ultimate aim appears to be the liquidation of mankind. Our technological society, as Ellul deemed it, has run amok. If we are to reassert our sovereignty, we must first come to a more exacting and holistic understanding of the human mind. Gerd Gigerenzer's notion of a human logic, once paired with Ellul's critique of technological society, helps us to achieve these. So my questions with this would be, it would be about your opinion on it. Do these psychopathic technocrats doubt their cognitive abilities too, and why trust in their own work?
Yeah, so just I'll give a little bit more background for your audience. Daniel Kahn. So the Heuristics and Research Biases program was an outgrowth of what's called the probabilistic revolution in psychology. And it was this movement basically was developed or an outgrowth of people like Herbert Simon, who were very influential in their, particularly in the early to mid 20th century. Gerd Gigerenzer, who's a German psychologist, he's what we would say an ecologist and a psychologist. So his psychological theories are couched within this environmentalist point of view. In other words, he's not an individualist. Gerd Gigerenzer, Kahneman would be more of an individualist. Gigerenzer would be an environmentalist. And in that sense, I mean that Gigerenzer emphasizes that human cognition evolved within the context of a physical space around us, right? Whereas the point of view from Kahneman kind of ignores everything that happens outside of the human brain. It treats the human as an atomic individual, a contextless individual, an environmentless individual, that the only object of study that matters are the cognitive processes that occur between our ears. And Gigerenzer would say, well, those cognitive processes evolved in particular contexts. So we can't make reference to psychological strategies or psychological functions without making reference to the environmental pressures that impinge on our cognitive function. So Gigerenzer points out that when psychology as a discipline became more mathematical and more statistically rigorous, that it became more individualistic as a result of that. I think the exact quote was, I'm probably not going to be able to pull it up. The statistical measures of the psychologist became were a referent to the specific statistician who was delivering them. I'm butchering the quote, but the exact quote is actually in the chapter. He's basically saying that the emphasis on statistical and mathematical logic was really an emphasis on the individual statistician doing the research. So it wasn't like a pure statistical methodology. It was a individual. Basically, this statistical revolution was laundering a hyperatomic individualistic philosophy into psychological research. Hopefully that made sense. And this would be the problem with the heuristics and research program, is that it set out, it then proceeded to make a set of claims about human cognition that were not factoring in ecological concerns. You didn't just evolve to think, you evolved to think in a particular way, in a particular environment, dealing with particular stressors and challenges and things like that. So the legacy of Kahneman's research has been that human cognition is faulty, because at least a quarter of the time, half the time, it leads to irrational, illogical conclusions. One of the most famous experiments, and by the way, Kahneman was a Nobel Prize winning behavioral economist. One of the most famous experiments that Kahneman conducted, I think it was called the librarian example. Just give me a quick second while I pull it up. So it was called the Linda problem. So I'm going to read this off to you. This is quote by quote a famous logical puzzle in Kahneman's research. Linda is 31 years old, single, outspoken, and very bright. She majored in philosophy. As a student, she was deeply concerned with issues of discrimination and social justice, and also participated in anti-nuclear demonstrations. Which is more probable? Linda is a bank teller, Or Linda is a bank teller and is active in the feminist movement. Now, what would you say based on that information?
The second.
And that's what his research found, is that most people assumed, based on the information provided, that she was a bank teller and she was active in the feminist movement. And the short version of why Kahneman says that this is wrong is that this is statistically naive. It fails to take into account all bank tellers and all women and all philosophically educated undergraduate students, such that you couldn't possibly come to that conclusion unless you were only taking into consideration the information provided in that puzzle. Now, this actually doesn't really make an intuitive sense. Why would you factor in information in your statistical calculation that is not presented to you within the boundaries of the circumstance? And so this is what Gigerenzer says, is that the statistical logic is laundering in this hyperatomic individualism. So interestingly, to go back to your question, that was a whole bunch of context. Kahneman, if you read his book Thinking Fast and Slow, he actually spends a fair amount of time talking about how much he doubts his own thought process and how much his own work caused him to think and reconsider and reconsider his faith in his own cognitive processes. And he says, ultimately there's a limit to how much of that you can do, and you just simply have to plow forward anyway. So to answer your question, yes, people like Kahneman do introduce that same skepticism into their own thought processes, but they also seem to hold themselves to a higher standard than the average person. And by virtue of being Kahneman's not a moron. He recently passed. He wasn't a moron and had a consciousness of himself as being smarter than the average person, having access to resources that the average person doesn't. And so he certainly retains for himself a certain privileged position that I don't think is unreasonable to accept for a person like him in his situation. But the problem isn't so much even that he doesn't subject himself to this rigorous program of doubt. It's that he has, for totally arbitrary reasons, accepted a type of statistical logic as normative for judging human cognition. That's actually the real problem. It's not like there's an innate polemic against expertise embedded in here. It's that that there's a presumptive and arbitrary application of a type of statistical reasoning that does not lead to a superior understanding of human psychology. To give you an example, he worked with the Israeli Defense Forces. He was a psychologist for the IDF, and he did all of this testing in the same way that Gerd Gigerenzer did. They both did all of this testing with an eye towards improving expertise. Both of their careers were studying human cognition to provide tools to expert technocratic classes to be more efficient in making high-pressure decisions in these very complex environments: medicine, finance, the military. And I just lost my train of thought. Help me out. Where was I going with that?
You were explaining what he wanted to do with his work. He wanted to make the managerial class more efficient.
Oh, I think I totally lost my train. I appreciate that. Yeah, but there was a point I was going to that I lost sight of. Okay, I recall now. So they're doing this research, and as a result of doing this empirical, quantitative, psychological research, Kahneman introduces these sort of philosophical concepts that are supposed to explain the shortcomings and limitations of human thinking. And so he proposes these ideas like System 1 cognition and System 2 cognition, which are they're basically the titular fast and slow of his book, Thinking Fast and Slow. One system in the mind operates quickly, operates intuitively, is more judgmental, or rushes to a judgment, and system two is slower, maybe more factual, more less judgmental, more, if you want to say, quixotic, maybe. And these are, well, quixotic wouldn't be the right word. Forget that. Quixotic has to deal with idealism. I don't know why that word popped into my head. But it was more exacting. I think that's probably what I was trying to think of. And these are models of the mind that don't actually cohere to a material reality in the brain. I referenced Freudianism in that essay, and as much as we can critique Freudianism, his tripartite model of consciousness has somewhat been vindicated by neurological research. You have the id, the ego, and the superego, and according to many people in psychiatry, psychology, neuroscience, this kind of maps to the three regions of the brain: prefrontal cortex, midbrain, hindbrain. There's a part of your brain that's more lustful, emotional, angry. There's a part of your brain that's more, again, exacting, more decisive, more what we would call executive level cognitive functioning. So while there's a lot of Freudian theory that is kind of bunk, there are certain aspects of his model that do map to a material reality. Kahneman's model, as far as I can see, I've never seen anyone propose otherwise, mystifies human cognition by artificially constructing these features of the mind that make his theory make sense, but don't make human psychology more coherent to us. So the issue isn't so much like Daniel Kahneman is not applying the same rigorous standard to himself. He does. It's that fundamentally his model of psychology doesn't actually clarify anything about human cognition. It mystifies human cognition to the point where his ultimate conclusion, as you read off before, is that, and this is also kind of like a very difficult thing to understand, how someone could come to this conclusion. Kahneman would have you believe that evolution, and he's an evolutionarily informed scientist, has worked for countless generations to produce the human body, the brain, the human animal, but it has produced us to be like kind of inefficient, incompetent, that your decision-making process is about as good as a 50-50 coin flip. So this type of social theorizing doesn't give us a better understanding of human consciousness. I guess ultimately that's what I'm trying to get at here.
Okay. One of the last questions would be connected to the race and to ethnicity and to to Bloom's Paul Bloom's racist babies that you mentioned in one of your essays. So, what is the ethnoscience? Should I read the whole passage for the context? It would probably be for the best. Yes. Paul Bloom's racist babies applies a critical psychological lens by which to understand the racially motivated reasoning of a certain class of social scientists. Here I reintroduce the notion of an ethnoscience, albeit with a few key modifications, to demonstrate how it is that the scientific method may be utilized to advance partisan interests. Of the social scientists discussed in this book, Paul Bloom is certainly the least famous, but he is far from the least noteworthy. His 2013 publication, Just Babies, is truly an exemplar of logical and empirical deficiency, and as such there is much to be learned from his work about how the modern-day academy truly operates. Furthermore, By critically analyzing his arguments, we stand to gain a far deeper understanding of what motivates the cult of equalitarianism. With with a proper understanding, it is possible to reassert our psychic and political sovereignty. Um, would you tell us some of Bloom's fallacies and fallacious reasoning you've been talking about?
Yeah, and I feel a little embarrassed. I want to apologize about that last segment. I didn't quite do justice to the rivalry between Giga Renzer and Kahneman. I promise to your audience it's a good read. I just didn't do so great a job of communicating it. But yeah, as relates to Paul Bloom, Paul Bloom has, you could say, has done some kind of revolutionary work in developmental psychology. If you're going through an undergraduate psychology program, most of the time, I would say like 99% of the time, you're going to hear about Jean Piaget, you're going to hear about Lawrence Kohlberg, and you're basically going to hear this story of human development that portrays cognitive development as this very tedious, slow burning, laborious process where much of the more executive, or maybe not even executive functions, but the more critical functions take years and years and years to empirically demonstrate themselves, to be empirically available to us. Piaget made the argument, and his research is still used today, like practically 100 years later, made the argument that infants and even toddlers have very rudimentary cognitive abilities, and his protege Lawrence Kohlberg similarly argued, although he had a much narrower scope in his research. Lawrence Kohlberg wasn't necessarily involved or interested in the entirety of human cognitive development. He was actually just interested in the emergence of our moral reasoning. He basically argued that, the kind of what we in liberal society valorize as like the highly individualistic, principle-oriented moral judgments. He basically argued that in most people is absent. And in the people that it's present in, it takes, the large part of our early life to really emerge. Now, Paul Bloom showed that in the first year of life that infants basically are capable of making friend and enemy distinctions, and that they show kinship preferences. His research at 3 months, 6 months, 10 months shows that infants can tell right from wrong, that they can tell friend from enemy, that they show a preference for pro-social behavior over anti-social behavior, that they show a preference for pro-social behavior over neutral behavior. Basically, these experiments were conducted by having like a sort of hand puppet minstrel show where, one puppet is being kind of a jerk and one puppet is being helpful, and there might be a third puppet that's just like passively observing the interaction but is not involved in any moral way. And so this was a pretty big deal when he demonstrated this research about 10 or 12 years ago, and he used that research to then make the argument, or tap dance around the argument, that because infants are capable of friend and enemy distinctions — I'm using Carl Schmitt's language, that was not Paul Bloom's language — they can tell, they have a preference for pro-social versus antisocial behavior. They have a preference for helping rather than hurting. Because they can tell the difference between right and wrong, that we have a moral responsibility to craft a more exacting anti-racist education of young children, because they have these innate capabilities. You don't have to wait until they get into elementary school. You don't have to wait until they're in junior high school for them to cognitively mature, to teach them about Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr. and the Holocaust and so on and so forth. You can actually do that fresh out the womb, practically. Within 12 weeks or so, you can teach them about Schindler's List, and you can teach them about Anne Frank, and so on and so forth. And there's an interesting quote. It's at the start of the chapter. It's actually a really horrifying quote. I'm going to pull it up here. Basically, he says, this is an essay he wrote for the New York Times, socialization is critically important, but this is not because babies and young children lack a sense of right and wrong. It's because the sense of right and wrong that they naturally possess diverges in important ways from what we adults would want it to be. So I want your audience to think about that, to just absorb that. It's not that children don't know right from wrong. It's that their idea of right and wrong is different from how liberal society wants it to be. So basically, he's talking about moral re-education as early as 3 months old. And again, you asked if I could explain some of the logical fallacies in his thinking. We're kind of winding down here, so I'll leave your audience with just one. It's a very similar problem to what Daniel Kahneman shows. It's that if you are, and Paul Bloom is, if you are an evolutionarily minded social scientist, then you can't assume that there's some kind of intrinsic problem with the cognitive features of humans if you accept the evolutionary premise. If you accept that evolution through generations or millennia of selection pressures have crafted us to be this highly tuned, refined social animal, then you can't turn around and say that what we do, what is native to us is wrong and has to be reprogrammed. You can't. Maybe you could, but you would have to provide some kind of novel argumentation to justify why it is that as an evolutionary thinker, you think evolution went wrong. And he doesn't do that. But what he does is pepper the whole book, Just Babies, with allusions to the Holocaust, with allusions to persecution of Jewish minorities around the world. In fact, every example he uses of social conflict, except for one, is about the treatment of Jews throughout Europe and throughout America. So you can't help but walk away with the impression that he's doing a kind of ethnic advocacy. And you alluded to at the beginning of the segment, what is ethnoscience? I basically make the argument that what Paul Bloom is doing, what Daniel Kahneman is doing, what people like Franz Boas had done in the past, what people like Noah Ignatieff had done in the past, is they are using the social sciences as a form of ethnic advocacy. Now, back in the 60s, there was this idea developed of what was called ethnoscience, and it was basically a way of describing like third world peoples and their ways of trying to understand the world. Right? If some backwards tribe or if an Aboriginal tribe has their own like pseudo scientific understanding of the world, well, that's just as legitimate as James Watson. It's just as legitimate as J. Robert Oppenheimer. It's just as legitimate as anything, Thomas Edison, so on and so forth. Which obviously we know that it is not. But basically, they're trying to put this third world knowledge power on the same footing as the developed industrial technological societies in the West. So I use that phrase ethnoscience to highlight that, okay, it's true. Different groups of people do have different ways of relating and explaining the world around them. When it comes to Jewish people, they don't use science. I'm making specific reference to the social sciences. They don't use the social sciences as a sort of tool to understand the world around us. They use it as a means to attack majority populations in the territories that they live. So for Paul Bloom to do this research that shows infants have a moral capacity under the year of 12 months, under the age of 12 months, he doesn't do that with the aim of furthering an understanding of the human animal. He does it with an aim towards creating more anti-white polemics and implementing them at earlier and earlier stages of human development. Basically, at a time where you can't resist the propagandization because you are neither physically nor cognitively able to advocate for yourself, which makes it even more pernicious.
I I tried to Google him, and I saw a tender ginger there, and for the mo- for the moment, I thought, this is some sort of Germanic guy, but it sure says, at least the Wikipedia entry says, that he was born into a Jewish family, so he was obviously ethnically motivated. Um, Although for the first moment when I saw him as a ginger, I thought he might be sponsored by them, or it might be that it's cool to be so pro Jewish in academia, which probably is, at least in this Ivy League sphere, or whatever. I don't know.
Yeah, he's Canadian and American, so he's really the worst of both worlds of dual citizenship. He's Jewish and he's Canadian. Sorry to the Canadian audience, I'm just kidding. But yeah, it's I chose him, to be honest with you. I don't say this to like brag or anything. It's really the worst book I've ever read. It's like really. I don't mean like it was boring. I don't mean like I wasn't stimulated by the writing. Like he's got bad prose. It is, for a Ivy League academic, the worst book I've ever read. There are no citations. There are no references. There are no arguments. And in fact, the reason I included Paul Bloom's essay in the book is because he was kind of my I used him as a template to craft my model of ethnoscience, the types of arguments that are implemented by Jewish ethnoscientists when they're trying to argue a point. So just to give a few examples, and I'll have to be brief. Throughout the book, he uses non sequiturs. He'll present an argument, or he'll present a challenge, and then he'll present a rebuttal, and they don't cohere whatsoever. He also offers false dialectics. One false dialectic is, or one or false dichotomy rather, is that these, if we want to call them evolutionary adaptations, are necessarily moral. I mean, this is like not a this would have to be, this is a position you'd have to tease out logically and demonstrate how this necessarily has a moral dimension, but he doesn't. Or rather, his justification is that because Jews are made victims of this discriminating kinship preference, that the capacity for us to differentiate between kin and non-kin necessarily has a moral, at the very least, a moral consequence. But he intrinsically treats them as moral functions, which is not immediately obvious. He doesn't produce evidence to support that claim, and so he sets up these sort of arbitrary dichotomies or arbitrary challenges to the audience that are not intrinsically justifiable from within the text. So I included him because I wanted a really strong justification for arguing that Jews practice this type of behavior I'm calling ethnoscience, and I think he basically makes the case for me.
Yeah, he obviously does. Uh, last two questions, or one or two, or maybe three. you do know Dr. E. Michael Jones, don't you?
I'm not personally, but I'm familiar with him.
Yeah. I had a couple of discussions with him in the past, and are you aware of his stance on race and ethnicity?
That there's no such thing as the white race, basically.
Yeah,
He said that the white race is like a capitalist construct because of Virginian tobacco companies or something.
I haven't heard this, but I heard him say that it's when Jews are trying to, I don't know, to divide and conquer by planting this artificial term into the American society. Basically, this is his argument. I mean, you can make an argument that this can be done and probably sometimes is done, but it doesn't imply that there is no such thing as a race. But he also believes that there are things like ethnicities. And I thought, okay, he thinks that there is such a thing as a German or a Slovene in my example, or a Serb or Albanian, but he obviously believes that the definition of ethnicity is totally it lacks the genetic component. So he says the implication of his definition of ethnicity is that you can make a black person a German if he learns the language, if he integrates into the culture, and if he becomes a Catholic. So you can make a Bavarian because Bavarians are Catholics. The majority of Bavaria is Catholic, and the implication of his definition is that a black person can be a Bavarian if he learns the language, if he integrates into culture, and he becomes a Catholic. This is his stance on it, and he obviously believes that this is a stance of Catholic Church on the same topic.
Yeah, I hesitate to comment because I don't know the full extent of how he presents these arguments. I listened to him talk to one of the Stone Choir guys, and I didn't really find his argumentation strong. He seems to think. I think he claims that language is the foundational basis of identity and culture, and that if you can learn a language and ingratiate yourself into a culture, then you can claim that identity for yourself. And I mean, I think, look, there's let's just be frank. Like, there's a degree to what he's said to that what he's saying is accurate. You can become psychologically, culturally acclimated to the norms and values of a particular people by living amongst them, by learning to be like them, by learning their tongue. But in a more material sense, in a longer time span sense, I mean, if I move to France and 10 generations of my family live in France, certainly by that 10th generation, they're more French than I was, but not more French than a person who has, 10,000 generations of their people, or however many, have lived in France, and they are, empirically, genetically French. A Algerian who then comes into France, who's part of the empire and speaks French and is familiar with the Catholic tradition and is familiar with the French legal system and maybe served in the French military. Certainly, they are more French than a Ukrainian person living in Ukraine or a Bolivian person living in Bolivia, but they're not more French than someone who's not a conquered subject of France. Someone who's a citizen. You can be a citizen. That's one thing, but you are not in a genetic or biological material sense. You are not part of that tribe in a way that I think most people understand that to mean. He did a recent podcast, and I didn't listen to it, but I think he was making the argument that I probably shouldn't talk too much about it because I didn't watch the whole thing. But it seemed that he was making the point that his issue with positively affirming white identity and white racialism was the disharmony it would cause for blacks. He was talking about the American context, that the white affirmation of a white racial identity would undo the racial harmony that America had achieved between the white and black population. To which I would say, what racial harmony? That's always been a fiction. And again, same thing with blacks in America. They are American in the sense that they are more American than they are African. You can't just drop someone from Inglewood into Nigeria and they're just going to be Nigerian, or wherever they may have originated from in Africa pre the Atlantic slave trade. So it's just you can't teach an old dog new tricks. I do think there's an element of, I hesitate to say moral cowardice, but some element of moral cowardice and an element of it conflicts with his universalist Catholic commitments. I don't really think that there's a conflict there. I don't think that there's any problem being a Catholic to say that there are multiple Catholic races. If the church is a universal church and we are proselytizing to the world, then that means there's more than one race of people that belong to the Catholic Church. But that doesn't mean that those other races also belong to anthropological or biological or cultural categories. I just think at this point, I kind of feel like he's undoing his legacy. To give another America-centric argument, it's like, I love the first 4 Metallica albums. The last 4 Metallica albums make me forget about the first 4, and like the last couple of years of E. Michael Jones's legacy make me forget about, the slaughter of the cities, the Jewish revolutionary spirit. He did a lot of good work, and he's undermining it by taking up this really unjustifiably ideological stance.
Yeah, I agree with it. Although I consider myself a Catholic too, but I have lately have had some also epistemological problems with coherence between being racially aware and ethnically aware and being a Catholic, to be honest, because it's hard to deny that Jesus had something about rabbis turning Judaism to ethnocentric religion. So he was obviously against it. And if you make white people's religion out of it, you have to make this conclusion that if you're now a follower of Jesus, he didn't want Jews to be ethnocentric. Why would he want you to be ethnocentric? Or I think that Catholicism is indifferent in the best way, but in the worst, it could be an argument can be made that it's against ethnocentricity, which is bad for the coherence between being racially aware and being a Catholic. But this is just my opinion.
I'm hesitant to touch on the religious question, partly because it's so contentious, partly because I have, like you, I have lifelong, since I was 9 or 10 years old, it's felt there's been aspects of the Christian faith and the Catholic faith that have not been coherent to me, internally coherent or coherent with how I wanted to live my life. But that to me is not even the biggest issue. But I don't view religious conviction as the biggest obstacle to identitarian politics. I don't think 400 years ago, a white Christian had a problem looking at non-white people and saying, we're not the same. And they may have wanted to share the gospel with them, and they may have wanted to evangelize and bring Christ to the world. But I don't think they had a problem recognizing the intrinsic differences between groups of people. To me, and this is why there isn't a chapter on religion in the book, because I'm much more focused on the technological aspect. I think the types of things that have eroded ethnocentrism, have eroded parochialism, have eroded our moral sensibilities. I think it has more to do with the advancement of capital. I think it has more to do with the emergence of the industrial society. The whole chapter on Kahneman gets into Jacques Ellul's theory of technique, and technique as a sort of metaphysical process erodes social and moral boundaries in a way that I don't think, to be honest with you, I don't think Christ and the church ever did. I don't think you can compare the way Christianity or Catholicism has treated the differences between people to what capital has done, or to what the technological society has done. I think those are much bigger problems. Christianity has been around a long time. The capitalism and industrialization are really only a couple of 100 years old, and that's where we've seen the most destruction to the coherence of people groups. I mean, the kinds of destructions that happened in the past were like military conquest, warfare, people getting put to the sword, and whole cities and libraries and communities decimated. And we never needed religion just to do that. You know what I mean? To lay it all on the doorstep of religion. But in the case of someone like E. Michael Jones, I do think he unjustly puts a religious flavor on his anti-racism in a way that undermines his Catholicism.
To be sincere about him, he does have a point to some extent about that it is about the perspective. American perspective is a little bit different than the European perspective. For example, this tension between blacks and whites, this is not our reality. This is not our perspective, although we do have more and more blacks in Europe.
Sad to say.
Yeah, because our dilemmas, at least not true public mainstream dilemmas from us autistic thinkers, nationalistic or ethnically aware thinkers, is, for example, our main dilemma is of whether Luka Doncic is a Serb or a Slovene. This is for American perspective is autistic, totally.
Right.
You wouldn't even Jared. I had a discussion with Jared Taylor. He doesn't understand this at all. For example, he would consider Albanians white, which is for Slovenes and Serbs totally unimaginable.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting how a perspective can define these things. Although I still think that it doesn't matter, even if it is dependable on perspectives, it does not follow. It's a non sequitur to say that there is no race.
Right. I agree. I won't touch on the European question. That's also very complicated. But I mean, to me, it's as comical, and sometimes you still hear people say this, not as much as you used to, but as people try to play the whole, well, there was a time in America where the Irish weren't considered white and the Italians weren't considered white, and people try to shoehorn in these ethnic grievances that, I mean, look, there was a political difference to be had, but it was never like, it was not the way that the anti-racist crowd tries to portray it. But I think this would probably be a good place to close it down. What do you think?
I agree with you. So once again, I thank you for accepting my invitation. Thank you for staying so long, for being so informative, thought provoking. I hope for the audience that they order your books, that they read them. I certainly will. I hope for you that you will become as viral as possible, that you will come to bigger podcasts and so forth, because I do think that you deserve it. And from me, that would be all.
I
Uh,
appreciate you having me on. You're actually, this was like one of the best conversations I've had. There's a lot of good back and forth early on. I wasn't prepared for what you brought, so it definitely made me work out my own thoughts. I hope the audience enjoyed it. Check out Imperium Press for my first two books, Antelope Hill for the most recent. Subscribe to me on jneal.substack.com. It's my blog. Check out my Twitter, still jneal. And that's it, man. Thank you so much. It was a great time. I appreciate it.
Thank you. I appreciate it too. Good afternoon. Yeah, good afternoon. He left. So to the audience, have a good evening if you're in Slovenia or in Europe, and for Americans, you probably will have an afternoon left. So good afternoon to you guys. To my Slovenian nationalist, Slovenia to Slovenes, there are no political solutions. In good night.